There's a particular kind of fear that lives in a barn. Not the fear of darkness or of cold or even of dying, though all three can find you there. This is the quieter kind. The kind that settles into the wood of the walls and the straw on the floor and the breath of every man who's ever stood at that gate and thought, not today. We had a horse on the Dellacroix spread that no one touched for 11 months. 11 months, through 2 early winters and 1 summer that nearly killed the grass and the goodwill of every hired hand we had. He stood in that far corner stall like something God had built in a bad mood, 16 hands of pure black fury, ribs you could count from 10 feet away, a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his jaw that looked less like an injury and more like a warning. He'd broken a man's arm in July, opened another man's shoulder with his teeth in August. By September, the foreman had nailed a red cloth to the stall gate, not to warn anyone just because he'd run out of ways to explain it. We called him Canon, because the first time he moved, it sounded like one going off. Nobody came near Canon anymore. Not the boys who'd been working horses since before they could read. Not the farrier who drove 40 miles and turned around in the yard without getting out of his wagon. Not even old Perch, who claimed loudly, constantly, to have gentled a Mustang with nothing but patience, and a song he'd learned from a Comanche trader. Old Perch tried once. Canon put him through a fence post. So when the mute cowboy showed up on a gray Thursday morning, hat soaked through from 2 days of rain, boots so worn you could see the shape of his toes through the leather, when he walked up to the foreman and held out a piece of paper that said, "I work horses. I'll take the black one." You can imagine what followed. Laughter mostly, the nervous kind. I was the one who stopped laughing first. I don't know why, maybe it was the way he stood, completely still while everything around him, the wind, the other hands, the skepticism in the air, moved. He just waited, paper held out, eyes level, like he had nowhere else to be and no particular preference about how this went. My name is Gideon Holt. I kept the ranch ledgers. I fixed the fences when I wasn't tallying grain costs, and I wrote down things I noticed in a small brown notebook I kept in my breast pocket. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I'd been doing it since I was 9 years old, and old habits carry their own kind of weight. I wrote down his name that morning. Eli, no last name given, mute since birth or near enough, came from the territory, took the black horse's stall without being told which one it was. That last part I added later, after I'd seen it happen. After everything. The foreman's name was Augusto Reyes, and he was a man who had made peace with most things in life through the application of stubbornness and bad coffee. He'd built the Dellacroix operation from a leaking bunkhouse, and 6 confused longhorns into something that moved cattle and turned a profit, and he had very little patience for complications. Canon was a complication. "You understand what you're asking," Augusto said, not quite as a question. The mute cowboy, Eli, nodded once. "You've seen him." Eli shook his head. He hadn't. He'd arrived in the dark before dawn, slept in the hay wagon, and come to the main house when the light came up. He didn't know what Canon looked like. He'd only heard, probably, whatever the men in town were saying, which by that point had graduated from dangerous to cursed, to something involving a river crossing that may or may not have been embellished. Augusto looked at him for a long moment, looked at the note, looked at the rest of us who were finding reasons to be nearby, checking bridles, moving buckets, doing the intricate nothing of men who are listening without appearing to. "Pays half rate until he's workable," Augusto said finally. "If he isn't workable in 30 days, I shoot him and we're done." Eli nodded again, folded the paper carefully back into his coat pocket, and turned toward the barn. Just like that. I followed at a distance, because it was my job to account for things, damage mostly, and the cost of damage, which in this case might include a funeral, and because I had the notebook and the habit. I told myself that was why. The barn was long and low and smelled of damp wood and old hay and the particular mustiness of animals that have been enclosed too long. Most of the horses knew me. They turned their heads as I passed, blinked, went back to eating. At the far end, past the water troughs and the empty stalls we hadn't used since the Dellacroix boys left for Kansas, Canon's gate was marked with the red cloth, which had gone dark with moisture and now hung like a wound. Eli stopped 10 feet from the gate. Canon heard him before he saw him. I know this because the sound changed, the low, constant movement of a horse in a confined space, the soft percussion of hooves on packed earth, it stopped. Everything in that stall went utterly quiet, and then Canon was at the gate, and he was exactly as advertised. I'd seen him before, of course, watched from this same distance while other men tried and failed. But there was something different about seeing him now, through Eli's presence, the way a painting changes when you stand next to someone who's really looking at it. Canon was larger than memory. The scar on his face caught the thin morning light, puckered old. Whatever made it had come from something deliberate, or at least something with terrible precision. His eyes were dark and enormous, and so full of something that wasn't anger exactly, something more specific than anger, that I had to look away for a moment. Eli didn't look away. He stood completely still, hands at his sides, no rope, no lead, nothing in his hands at all, just standing, just breathing. Canon threw his head back and hit the gate once with his chest, a sound like a drum, and Eli didn't move, not a step back. Not a flinch I could see. He might have breathed differently. I was too far to tell. This went on for a long time. Canon paced, threw himself sideways, made noises, not screaming, not the high distress sound the other men had triggered, but something lower, more private, like he was arguing with himself. Eli watched with the same expression throughout, which was not calm exactly and not detached. It was something I didn't have a word for yet, so I wrote in my notebook, focused inward. The way a man looks when he's remembering something painful. After maybe 40 minutes, Canon stopped pacing. He stood at the far end of the stall, head lowered, one ear turned toward Eli and one turned away. His flanks were moving. He was tired or pretending to be tired or doing something in between. Eli sat down on the ground. I nearly wrote it down before I realized I was staring. He sat cross-legged in the hay and manure outside the gate and simply stayed there. Like he'd decided this was where he lived now, like he had cleared the rest of his calendar. His hat was in his lap. His hair was dark and needed cutting, and there was a thin scar along his jaw, not as dramatic as Canon's, thinner, the kind that comes from wire or glass rather than anything intentional. He closed his eyes. I waited, not sure if I should leave. After another 20 minutes, Canon moved to the gate again. He put his nose through the bars and exhaled a long, complicated exhale, the kind that carries something, and Eli's eyes opened. He looked up. They regarded each other from a distance of about 3 feet, and nothing happened, and it was the loudest nothing I'd witnessed in my life. I wrote they recognized each other. I don't know what that means, but I believe it. I had work to do. I always had work to do. The Dellacroix operation ran on numbers that never quite added up without someone pushing them. And that someone was usually me, bent over a desk in the back office with a lamp that needed its wick trimmed and a window that rattled every time the wind came from the north. I went back to that desk. I did the numbers, but I kept looking up. By noon, I'd found 3 reasons to walk past the barn. The first time, Eli was still sitting outside the gate. Canon was closer, not at the gate, maybe 6 feet back, but facing toward rather than away, which I had never seen. The second time, Eli was eating. He'd produced something wrapped in cloth from his coat pocket. I couldn't tell what, and he ate slowly, methodically, without looking at Canon. And Canon watched him with the ear-forward attention of a horse that has decided something might be interesting after all. The third time I stopped walking. Eli had moved. He was standing now, still outside the gate, but his right hand was extended through the bars at a low angle, not reaching for Canon, not beckoning, just placed there open, palm up like an offering or maybe just a fact. Here is a hand. It is not a threat. Make of it what you will. Canon stood 4 feet away, head low, nostrils going. He'd been smelling this man for 6 hours. He knew everything about him that a nose could know. It took 11 more minutes. I know because I watched the whole thing, and I timed it without meaning to, counting my own heartbeats, which is a terrible way to measure time, but the only one I had. 11 minutes, and then Canon crossed those 4 feet and put his nose against Eli's palm. Not gently. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was suspicious and pressured, and it lasted maybe 2 seconds before he pulled back and threw his head up and went to the far corner again. But he'd done it. He'd made contact with a human being for the first time in 11 months without drawing blood. I stood in the doorway of that barn and felt something move in my chest that I couldn't name. I wrote first contact, 1423, Canon's terms. That evening at supper, the hands wanted to know. I was the one who'd been watching, which made me the one who had to explain, and I found that I didn't want to explain, not because I was protective of the information, but because I wasn't sure words would do anything to it except make it smaller. I said Eli was working the horse. I said there'd been progress. I said Canon hadn't tried to kill him. Yet, said a man named Cord, who had the scarred shoulder and the grudge to match it. Yet, I agreed because it was honest. What's he doing different? I thought about it. Nothing, I said, and that was the honest answer too, and also completely wrong, and I knew it even as I said it. What Eli was doing different was the nothing, the particular quality of it. The way he withheld the expectation, the agenda, the human need to make something happen and call it progress. He'd sat in manure for the better part of a day and offered one open hand and let Canon decide what to do with it. And that patience, not the cultivated patience of a man who is trying to be patient, but the real kind, the kind that has given up on outcomes, was not nothing. It was maybe the hardest thing I'd ever watched anyone do. But I didn't say any of that. I ate my supper and listened to Cord complain about his shoulder and thought about a horse with a scar and a cowboy who couldn't speak, and whether they'd recognized something in each other that the rest of us were simply too loud to notice. Eli slept in the barn that first night. He didn't ask permission. He appeared at the barn door after supper with his bedroll, glanced once in my direction. I happened to be nearby, ledger in hand, pretending to check something by lamplight, and went inside. I heard him settle. Heard Canon's restless movement slow down and then, after a while, stop almost entirely. I stood outside the barn for longer than was sensible, listening to that quiet. There are sounds that mean something is wrong, and sounds that mean something is right, and sounds that don't mean either. They just mean things are happening, and we don't know yet what kind. The barn that night made the third kind of sound. Low, attentive, like everything inside it was waiting without knowing what it was waiting for. I went to bed. In my notebook before I slept, I wrote, Eli didn't bring a rope. He doesn't own one, I think. I should ask him tomorrow. I should ask him a lot of things. And then underneath that, because I was tired and my filter was low, I've been around horses my whole life, and I've never sat with one the way he sat with Canon today. I wonder what I've been doing instead. The next morning, I went to the barn early. Canon was at the gate, nose through the bars again, not pacing. Eli was awake, or had he slept? There was no way to tell with him, that perfect stillness, sitting on his bedroll with his back against the wall opposite the stall, maybe 8 feet away. He had a small knife out and was cleaning his fingernails with it, which is such an ordinary human thing to do that it caught me off guard. I'd started to think of him as something other than ordinary. He saw me and lifted his chin slightly, a greeting. I held up my notebook, held up a pencil, gestured between us. He tilted his head, not no, not yes, something that meant go ahead if you want. I came closer and crouched down against the wall beside him, and I wrote, "How did you know to come here?" He considered. Then he reached over and took the pencil, gently, the way he did everything, like he understood the weight of objects, and wrote in the margin of my page, "Heard about the horse in town. Couldn't sleep." I took the pencil back. "Why couldn't you sleep?" A pause. Then, same reason he can't. I looked at Canon, who was watching us with one dark eye and his scar and his impossible size, and I didn't ask what that reason was. Some things you write down and some things you leave room for. Eli nodded. "Were you scared?" He thought about this for longer than I expected. Then he took the pencil and wrote one word, "Yes." I looked at him. He was looking at Canon. "But you didn't move." He gave the pencil back. He had written, "That's the whole thing." By the end of the first week, Canon let Eli into the stall. It didn't happen dramatically. There was no triumphant moment, no burst of music from the clouds, no round of applause from the hands who had gathered, as they inevitably had, to watch from a careful distance. Eli simply opened the gate one morning, having spent 6 days working up to it the way you work up to a difficult conversation, by circling closer each day without quite arriving, and walked in, and stood there, and Canon turned to face him, and they were in the same space, and no one died. Cord watched from the fence and said nothing, which from Cord was practically a standing ovation. What I noticed from my position by the barn wall, Canon's scar. From this angle in this light, I could see that it wasn't one wound but several overlapping ones, healed at different times. Something had happened to this horse more than once and more than accidentally. The regularity of the scarring had a human origin. I wrote that down. I circled it. And then I noticed Eli's hands. He was standing with his arms at his sides, palms out slightly, that habitual offering posture, and his hands were mapped with the same kind of evidence. Not identical to Canon's, smaller and more varied, but the same grammar, the record of repeated harm. I put my pencil down. Some things you observe as a ledger keeper, and some things you observe as a human being, and they require different kinds of notation. I didn't write anything for several minutes. I just watched Eli stand in that stall with his scarred hands open at his sides, and Canon lower his enormous head until the top of his nose was nearly level with Eli's chest, and neither of them move. The sound in the barn was the third kind again, the waiting kind. I thought, they're not teaching each other anything. They're recognizing each other. And I thought, that's a different thing entirely. That's something I don't know how to count. That night, Augusto stopped me in the yard. Well, he said, he meant, is this working, will it hold, do I have a horse or a liability? Progress, I said. What kind? I thought about Eli's hands. I thought about 11 months of red cloth and broken fences, and a horse that no one could touch. I thought about one man sitting in manure for 6 hours without an agenda. The slow kind, I said, the real kind. Augusto looked at me with the expression he used when the numbers didn't add up, but he decided to let it go. 30 days, he said. Less, I said, and I was surprised to hear myself say it. He walked away. I stayed in the yard a moment longer, notebook in hand, the cold coming up from the ground and the sky beginning to dark and the barn behind me lit by a single lamp that threw Eli's shadow long across the hay. I wrote day 7. Canon has not tried to kill anyone in a week. Eli's doing something I can't name with a word I know. Maybe that's the point. What I hadn't written yet, what I was still trying to find the language for, was the thing I'd seen on the 4th day. Eli had been in the stall for maybe 2 hours, standing, moving in slow arcs, letting Canon track him and choose whether to follow. At one point, Canon had followed, cautiously, reluctantly, the way you follow someone you've decided to distrust less than you'd planned. And Eli had stopped, and Canon had stopped behind him, and without turning around, Eli had reached back and placed one hand against Canon's chest. Not his face, not his neck, his chest over the heart. Canon had gone absolutely still. Eli had kept his hand there for a long time. His head was bowed. From the doorway I couldn't see his face, only the line of his back and the set of his shoulders, and something in that line. Something about the way he was bent, not broken but bowed. The way a tree bends in whether it's decided to survive made me close my notebook. Because that gesture wasn't training. That was two living things acknowledging each other's damage. That was a hand placed over the place where something once broke, and the choice, the daily, grinding, effortful choice, to still be here, to still be standing, to extend a hand toward something frightening because you understood from the inside what it felt like to have been made frightening by what was done to you. I walked back to my desk and sat for a while without working. Some things you don't write down immediately. You let them sit in you first and see what they do. The second week was where things got complicated. That's generally how it goes in my experience, not with horses specifically, but with anything worth watching. The first movement forward carries its own momentum. It's clean and it's hopeful, and everyone who's been watching from the fence starts to believe that the hard part is over. It never is. The hard part is almost always the second part, when the first thing has happened, and now you have to decide what to do with it. Eli had gotten into the stall. Canon had let him. That was the first part. Now there was an understanding of some fragile, untested kind between them, and it was in the nature of fragile things to either strengthen or break, and you couldn't always control which way it went. You could only keep showing up. Eli kept showing up. Every day before the light was full, after supper. Twice in the night I heard him walking, not loudly. Eli moved like a man who had learned to take up minimal space, and each time I knew where he was going. The barn, Canon's stall, the red cloth which Eli had taken down on the 3rd day and folded neatly and placed on the fence post, which struck me as a deliberate gesture without being a dramatic one. We won't need this anymore, not a declaration, just a housekeeping decision. I thought about that cloth a lot in those days. On the 8th morning, I went to the barn and found something unexpected. Eli was there as usual, but Canon was not in his stall. The gate was open. I felt the specific kind of adrenaline that comes from a large, dangerous animal being unaccounted for, and I was halfway to turning and raising the alarm when I walked past the gate and saw them. They were in the back of the barn, in the open area behind the stalls where hay bales were stored and equipment was kept, and nothing much happened. Canon was standing loose, no halter, no rope, nothing in the middle of that space, and Eli was about 10 feet from him, and they were just existing in the same room. Canon turned his head when I came in, watched me. His eye was the same, dark, enormous, complicated, but the quality of his attention had changed in some way I couldn't quantify. Before, his attention had been a weapon he kept aimed. Now it felt more like a question he was deciding whether to ask. I walked very slowly to the wall and didn't make sudden gestures. Eli glanced back at me, nodded once. "Everything is fine, don't be an idiot about it." I wasn't entirely sure I could manage that, but I stayed still and I breathed and I watched. What I noticed, Eli was walking. Not toward Canon, not circling him, just walking, slow and even in no particular pattern. He'd take 4 steps this direction, stop, take 3 steps that way, pause, and Canon was tracking him. Not with suspicion exactly, or not only with suspicion, but with the alert focus of a creature that has decided another creature is worth tracking. The way you watch something that surprises you by continuing to be interesting. After maybe 20 minutes of this, Eli changed the pattern. He walked toward a hay bale, sat down on it, and stopped moving entirely. Canon waited. Then Canon walked toward him. Slow, deliberate, ears forward. He stopped about 3 feet away and his head came down and he sniffed at Eli's coat, his shoulder, his hat, with the thoroughness of someone reviewing documentation. Eli sat completely still and let this happen. His hands were in his lap, not extended, not offered, just present, just there. Canon finished his inspection. He exhaled, that complicated exhale again, the one with things in it, and then he did something I don't quite have the language for even now. He lowered his head further until his jaw was resting on Eli's shoulder. Not leaning, not pressuring. Just resting. Eli's hand came up slowly and settled on the side of Canon's neck, just behind the jaw, just below the scar. They stayed like that for a long time. I did not write anything in my notebook for the entirety of it. I was afraid the sound of the pencil would break something. That afternoon, everything went wrong. In the way things go wrong out here, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small forces that you don't see until they've already combined. Cord's shoulder had been aching for a week, and the ache made him short-tempered, and the short temper made him careless, and the carelessness got into him like a second mood riding the first. He'd been watching Eli's progress with Canon with the expression of a man, watching someone get credit he believes he's owed. I saw it building. I should have said something. What happened? Cord came into the barn in the early afternoon, while Eli was in the stall with Canon, working. Eli's definition of working was different from anyone else's, which is to say it looked like standing near a horse and doing nothing. But by now I'd learned to see the texture of that nothing, the tiny adjustments and offerings and withdrawals that made it a conversation rather than an absence. Cord came in with the energy of a man looking for something to test. He walked to the gate. He watched for a moment, and then he said, "Doesn't look like much progress to me." Eli didn't respond. He couldn't, and even if he could have, I don't think he would have. "Just saying," Cord said, and his voice had that particular quality, not aggressive outright, but probing, the way you push at something to see what kind of pain it makes. "I tried to work that horse for 2 months before he took my shoulder. 2 months. You've been here 9 days, and everyone's acting like you walked on water." Canon's ear went back. One ear, the one toward Cord. "Must be some kind of trick," Cord said. And then he did the thing. I think he meant it to be funny or dismissive or some performance of skepticism. He slapped the gate. Flat-handed hard, the way you might if you were trying to startle something into showing its real nature. What followed happened fast and then slow in the way things do when your memory is running at 2 speeds simultaneously. Canon spun, not toward Eli, away from him, and hit the back wall with his shoulder and made a sound I hadn't heard him make before, which was not anger but fear, pure and animal and ancient. His hooves came up once and down. His entire body went into a kind of controlled explosion, and Eli was in the middle of it, and for 1 second everything in my chest seized. Then Eli was beside Canon's neck, both hands up, not gripping, placing. Like before. Like the gesture I'd seen 4 days ago that I hadn't been able to name. He'd moved fast enough to get there, and then he became still, and his hands were on Canon, and he was making something. Not a sound. He couldn't make a sound. He was making a presence, some quality of being there that was steady enough to land on. I don't know another way to say it. He was being there in a way that Canon could feel through his hands and through whatever electric thing runs between frightened creatures and calm ones when the calm one decides to stay. Canon's hooves stopped. His breathing didn't stop. It came in huge heaving pulls that shook his whole barrel, but the movement stopped, and his head came down and Eli's forehead went against his neck, and for a moment neither of them moved. I looked at Cord. Cord was pale. Whatever he'd meant to prove, or maybe he hadn't meant anything except to scratch at an itch. It had shown him something he didn't like about himself, and he knew it. His hand was still on the gate. His face had the careful blankness of a man who has just walked into a room he can't walk out of unchanged. Nobody said anything. I walked to him, which required moving my feet deliberately because my body was still in the alarm of 30 seconds ago. I walked to him and I said, quietly, so only he could hear, "Don't come back in here unless he asks you." Cord looked at me, then at Eli and Canon, who were still in their position, forehead to neck, both breathing, both choosing to still be standing, then back at me. He left without arguing. That was the most surprising thing. Eli stayed in the stall for another hour after that. I stayed outside it. Not hovering, just present in the way I'd learned from watching him be present, which was to take up space without filling it, to make an available silence rather than a demanding one. When he came out, his face was, I'd seen Eli's face in a few different conditions by this point, and I'd been developing a small private catalog of its expressions since the usual communication shortcuts weren't available and I had to read with more care. This expression was new, not upset, not relieved, something that sat between exhausted and resolved, the way a thing looks when it has cost something and still held. He came and sat beside me on the hay bale outside the stall. I held out the notebook and pencil, not asking anything, just making it available. He took the pencil, wrote he remembered something, I don't know what, but he came back from it. I read it, I wrote, did you? Eli looked at the question for a moment, then he wrote, every day. I read that, I didn't write anything else for a while. Then I wrote, what happened to your hands? I wasn't sure he'd answer. It was an overstep. I knew it as I wrote it, but it was out, and I couldn't take it back, and something in me needed to know what I'd been looking at for 9 days. Eli held the pencil for a long time, long enough that I thought he'd decided to leave it unanswered, which was his right, and I was about to say something that would change the subject when he wrote. Same thing that happened to his face. Different man, same thing. I put my notebook in my pocket. I didn't look at him immediately. I watched the barn doors, the late light coming through the gaps in the wood, the dust in that light, and I sat with what he'd written and let it be what it was. After a while I said, quietly, not quite to him, I'm sorry. He touched my arm once, brief, factual. Then he went back to the stall and I heard him settle and I heard Canon's restless movement, diminished now, slower, the movement of a creature calming rather than agitating, and then the quiet again. The third kind of quiet, the waiting kind. Except, and this is what I wrote that night, the last thing before I slept, it didn't feel like waiting anymore. It felt like something that had already arrived and was deciding whether to stay. On the 10th day, Augusto came to see for himself. He stood in the barn door, arms crossed, face doing the arithmetic. He watched Eli move through the stall, still no halter, still no rope, Eli conducting the whole relationship on terms of mutual consent, which was philosophically interesting and practically baffling to most working ranchers. And he watched Canon track Eli with the ear-forward interest that had replaced the ear-back hostility of 2 weeks ago. Still no lead on him, Augusto said. No, I said. How's he going to work if I can't put a lead on him? He's working, I said. Look at him. Canon had moved to Eli's shoulder and was breathing onto his collar. Eli was standing there taking it, that faint suggestion of amusement in the corner of his mouth that was the closest thing he had to a grin. They were having some kind of exchange involving breath and weight and the micro-adjustments of proximity, and it looked from the outside like absolutely nothing, and it was clearly the entire world. Augusto watched for another minute. 20 days left, he said. He won't need 20, I said. Augusto gave me the arithmetic expression again. You sound sure. I'm not, I said, but I think he's not either, and that's somehow making it work. He shook his head in the way men do when the answer doesn't fit the question they actually asked, and they decide to let it go for now. He left, I stayed. What happened on the 12th day was the part that shook me. Not dramatically, nothing that would make a story in the traditional sense, nothing with an obvious shape. Just a moment mid-morning, while I was doing what I was always doing, watching with a notebook, being the man who observed and wrote and tried to account for things. Eli was grooming Canon. He'd gotten to this 3 days ago, the first physical task beyond simple presence, moving in slow, careful strokes with a brush covering ground that no one had covered in nearly a year. Canon accepted it with the dignity of something that has decided to trust a specific person and is still mildly offended by the whole concept of trust. I was watching the brush move over the area near the scar when Eli stopped. He put the brush down, he raised his hand. Slowly, with the same quality of motion he applied to everything, not tentative exactly, but considered, the way you move toward something you respect, he placed his fingers against the scar itself. Not the area near it, the scar. Canon went still. Eli's hand rested there for, I couldn't have told you, my sense of time had gone strange, some measure of seconds or minutes, light and steady, and his face was bent down and I couldn't read it, but I could read the line of his back again, and it was the same line it had been on the 4th day. The bow without the break, the thing choosing to hold. Canon's eye closed. I write that and it looks small, an eye closing. Horses close their eyes, it's not remarkable. But this was the eye that had watched every person in this barn for 11 months with the particular vigilance of a creature that has learned the world contains violence and has decided to be ready for it always. And it closed, in Eli's hand, on the scar. I wrote nothing. My hand was on my notebook and I wrote nothing, because some things don't survive transcription, and I knew this was one of them. I watched instead. I let it happen to me the way it was happening to both of them, and I felt something move in my chest that I recognized from childhood, from being very young and having someone press their hand against a wound, and the sudden, shocking relief of being attended to. Canon leaned into Eli's hand. Just slightly, a 1/4 inch maybe. The kind of lean that isn't physical communication but something underneath it. The kind that says, I've been holding all of this alone for a long time, and right now, I don't have to. Eli's other hand came up, both hands against the scar, his forehead down again against Canon's neck. And I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that Eli wasn't healing Canon. That's not what was happening. Canon wasn't being fixed, wasn't being rehabilitated in the clean sense, wasn't being led from damage to whole by a skilled and patient craftsman. What was happening was something different and more honest. 2 things that had been hurt badly were in the same space, and one of them had opened his hands, and the other had found that survivable. That's all. That's everything. By the 17th day, I'd stopped writing observations. I'd started writing something else. I wasn't sure what to call it. Not a report, not a ledger. The numbers were still getting tallied somewhere, the grain costs and the fence repairs and the labor hours, but in my small brown notebook there were increasingly fewer numbers and increasingly more of the other thing. The thing that happens when you watch something for long enough that it gets inside you and starts doing its work there. Eli had Canon on a rope by the 15th day. Not a lead in the conventional sense. A long, loose line of braided leather that Eli had made himself. I'd watched him do it over 2 evenings in the barn, his hands moving slowly and without hesitation through the plaiting in a way that made me think he'd done it many times before in many other places, for many other reasons. He'd fashioned a loop at one end that rested barely against Canon's neck, not secured, not knotted in any way that held, just lying there, the rope a courtesy rather than a constraint, a shared language rather than a law. Canon wore it without complaint. Cord watched this from the fence one morning and said, "That's not training." No, I agreed. What is it then? I thought about it. Negotiation, I said, which wasn't quite right either, but was closer than anything else I had. Cord was quiet for a moment. Then, my shoulder's been bothering me less. I looked at him. He wasn't looking at me. He was watching Canon walk, slowly, in a wide circle, Eli at his shoulder rather than ahead of him, the rope slack as a suggestion, with an expression that I can only describe as something undergoing revision. Probably the cold changing, he said and walked away. I let him have that. On the 18th day, something happened that I have thought about almost every day since. Eli came to find me in the office. This was unprecedented. He'd never sought me out before, only received me in the barn when I presented myself. He appeared in the doorway with his hat in his hands, turning it in that habitual way that I'd catalogued as his version of nervous energy, and he waited until I noticed him. I looked up. Come in. He came in, sat in the chair across from my desk that people sometimes used when they needed to dispute an accounting or ask about their pay. He looked at my desk for a moment, then reached over and picked up the pencil I kept there, not my notebook pencil, the longer one, the ledger pencil, and pulled a page from the stack of spare paper I kept for rough calculations. He wrote for a while, more than usual. I waited without reading, watching his hand move. When he pushed it across the desk, it read, "He's going to be ready soon. The horse. You can tell Augusto he can work." I want to be clear about what I mean by ready. He'll accept a rider he chooses. He won't accept a rider he doesn't. That has to be understood before anyone gets on him. If you put the wrong person on him, it'll undo everything. I'm not saying this to make conditions. I'm saying it because I watched what happens when you don't understand what a thing is and you try to use it the way it used to be used. I read it twice. Then I wrote back I'd started doing this, taking a piece of spare paper rather than my notebook, making it more like a correspondence than a record. What does he choose by? Eli took the pencil. Same thing everyone does, whether you're afraid of him. He can smell fear that comes from threat. He can't smell fear that comes from respect. The second kind he's fine with. The first kind, he remembers what followed it. I sat with that. What about you? I wrote. When he's workable, what do you do? He considered the question for a long time. Longer than any answer I'd seen him compose. Long enough that I thought he'd decided to move away from it. Then, I don't know yet, I move. I've always moved. Something gets better and I make sure I'm not there when people try to take credit for it. I read this and felt something tighten in my chest. Not grief, something more specific. Recognition, maybe. The particular ache of watching someone describe their own pattern as if it belongs to circumstance rather than choice. I wrote, "You could stay." He looked at it, looked at me. His expression was the one I hadn't been able to catalog. The open one, the unguarded one, the one he wore sometimes in the barn when he thought no one was watching. He wore it now, and it lasted only a moment, and then he folded the papers, both of ours, mine and his, and put them in his coat pocket and stood up. He didn't answer. He went back to the barn. I stayed at my desk and looked at my hands, which were empty, and did not do the numbers for a long time. On the 19th day, Eli put a saddle on Canon for the first time. Not a full saddle, a blanket and a light pad, nothing more, laid across Canon's back with the slow deliberation that characterized every action Eli took. Canon accepted it. He flicked one ear at it and shifted his weight once and then stood still, the way a person stands when they're deciding that something they'd have objected to yesterday is something they can tolerate today because the person asking has earned a specific kind of latitude. I was there. I was always there by that point. The ledgers were getting done on their own schedule, which was to say not always on time, but Augusto had stopped commenting on it, which I was choosing to interpret as tacit approval. What I noticed about that morning, the light. It was one of those winter mornings when the cold makes everything precise, edges sharpened, colors stripped to their clearest versions, the brown of the barn wall and the black of Canon's coat and the blue of the sky through the open doors all sitting next to each other without compromise. Eli's breath came out in clouds. Canon's was larger. The blanket was dark green, almost gray in that light. I wrote day 19, saddle blanket. Canon's ear tipped once. Eli waited him out. Then Canon dipped his head and exhaled and they carried on. What I didn't write, not then, I wrote it later, was that when the blanket settled on Canon's back, Eli put his hand on it and stood very still for a moment with his eyes closed. Not in relief, not in triumph, in something quieter. The gesture of a man registering something before it passes. The way you press your hand against a warm surface before you leave a room, because you're not sure you'll be warm again for a while. I wrote that later, after. The 30th day came. Augusto walked into the barn in the early morning and stood at the gate of Canon's stall, which was open. He walked to the back and stood in the open area. He looked at Canon, who looked back at him with the not-quite challenge, not-quite invitation that I'd come to recognize as his version of equilibrium. Eli was standing near the hay bales. He nodded to Augusto. Augusto said, "Well." Canon's ear went forward, then sideways, then forward again. A listening ear, a considering ear. "Does he go?" Augusto asked. Eli nodded. "Under saddle." Another nod, then Eli held up one finger, one condition. Augusto waited. Eli picked up the pencil from the ledge where he kept it now, alongside my notebook, which had migrated to the barn without me quite deciding to move it. He wrote on the board where stall assignments were chalked, wrote large enough for Augusto to read from where he stood. "He chooses, not you." Augusto read it again, looked at Canon, looked at Eli. "You're telling me the horse decides who rides him?" Eli nodded. "I run a working ranch." Eli nodded again. "That's not how." Eli picked up the chalk and added one line under the first. "It's the only way ITWORKS." A long silence. The particular silence of a practical man making peace with something impractical that has turned out to be the only thing that worked. "All right," Augusto said, and then after a moment, "What's your read on who he'll take?" Eli considered, looked at me. I looked at him, at the notebook on the ledge, at Canon, who had turned his head toward me with the ear-forward attention. "Me," I said. My voice was strange, too high. Eli nodded, he touched his chest, then pointed at me, then at Canon. Whatever the gesture meant exactly, I understood it. Same thing, something similar. He'll recognize it. I didn't know what to say about being recognized in that context. I was the man who kept the ledgers. I'd spent 30 days watching at a distance, recording, staying to the wall, maintaining the comfortable remove of an observer. I was not a rider. Not anymore. I'd ridden as a boy, badly, and a fall from a fence rail at 14 had given me a fear of large animals that I'd been managing in various ways for 30 years, mostly by keeping ledgers. Canon looked at me. The ear-forward look. "I haven't ridden in," I started. Eli picked up the chalk, wrote, "I know." "Then why?" He added, "Same reason he'll take you." I didn't understand that for a moment. Then I did. And I almost laughed, not because it was funny exactly, but because it had that quality that the truest things sometimes have, of being so straightforward it surprises you. I was afraid. Not the threat fear, not the aggression fear, the other kind. The fear of a thing you respect enough to be uncertain about. The fear that comes from knowing you're in the presence of something larger than you and choosing to stay anyway. Canon smelled that kind. Eli had said so. I put my notebook in my breast pocket. I walked toward the stall. There are things that are worth describing in full, and things that deserve to be left a little incomplete, because completeness would make them something other than what they were. What I'll say is this. The saddle was placed on Canon's back and he accepted it. The girth was tightened very slowly and he accepted it. He moved once forward 2 steps, then stopped, and Eli put his hand on his neck and he stopped moving. I stood beside them for a long time before I touched the saddle. My hand was not steady. Eli was watching Canon, not me. He was doing what he always did, paying attention to the thing that needed the most attention in any given moment. Canon was calm. Eli kept him calm by being in that particular quality of stillness. It fell on you like a shadow if you stood close enough, that stillness. You could feel its edges. I put my foot in the stirrup. Canon's ear went back. Eli's hand went to his neck. The ear came forward again. I got on. I don't have adequate language for the next 30 seconds. My body remembered being on a horse before my mind caught up the balance, the width, the warmth through the saddle, the living movement of breath between my legs. Canon's barrel expanded and contracted with a steadiness that was nothing like what I'd seen in his worst moments, and nothing like the frozen stillness of his best ones. Just the steady respiration of a large creature carrying a weight it has decided to accept. He didn't move, he didn't have to. I sat on Canon's back, in the barn that had been named Impossible for 11 months, and the light came in through the gaps in the wood and lay across us in the specific pattern of a winter morning. And I looked at Eli, who was looking back at me with the expression I'd never been able to catalog. I understood it now. It was the look of someone watching a thing they did not expect to get to see. Not pride, something quieter. The look of a person who has spent a long time believing the things they could do were too small or too slow or too wordless to matter, and who is watching, right now, something that argues otherwise. I raised my hand. No other gesture came. He raised his. 2 days later, Eli was gone. Not dramatically. He left what he always left, nothing much. His bedroll space was empty. The brush was still on its hook, the chalk on the board. The rope he'd made was hanging on the gate, coiled neatly, which I think was meant to stay, not forgotten, left. The distinction mattered. I found one piece of paper on the hay bale outside Canon's stall. Not addressed to me, not addressed to anyone. It said in his careful, particular handwriting, "He knows what he is now. That's enough." And underneath that, in smaller letters, "So do I." I've thought about how to account for what Eli did on the Dellacroix spread in the language of the work I do, the numbers and the tallies and the cost-per-outcome ledgers that make up a working ranch's relationship with the world. I've tried to fit it into those columns, and it doesn't fit. The column for what you spend is easy enough. 30 days, one man's half wages, a rope. The column for what you get is harder. A horse that works. A change in how the barn sounds in the evening. Cord's shoulder, which he claims feels better, which may be the cold and may be something else. And this, which I've been sitting with since the morning I found that paper, the understanding that some things don't fix exactly. Some things just find the conditions in which they can keep going. The conditions involve someone who is also keeping going, by choice, every day, in spite of whatever record their hands carry. The conditions involve opening both hands and standing still and being afraid in the right kind of way. Canon is still difficult. He's not a different horse. He's the same horse with the same history, wearing it in the same place on his face. He'll take 3 riders now by choice on his own assessment. He still won't take Cord, which Cord is handling with more grace than I expected. In the mornings, before the light is full, he stands at the gate and looks down the road. I don't know what he's waiting for. I keep the rope coiled on the gate where Eli left it.